All right, the title of our next panel is Limiting Long-Term Space Debris, the Role of Responsible Behavior in Addressing the Threat of Debris in Space. To moderate this panel, we are pleased to have Major Brian Green, the Chief of Space and Operational Law for Space Training and Readiness Command, or STARCOM, one of the brilliantly named Space Force commands. This new field command builds and leads the U.S. Space Force's education, training, doctrine, range, aggressor, and test programs. Major Green received his LLM in Air and Space Law from McGill University. Over to you, Major Green.
Thank you, Professor Diller. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am pleased to present this distinguished panel that we have here on stage with me today and joining us by the miracle of the internet. I'd like to start with Dr. Everett Dolman. He is the Professor of Comparative Military Studies and Strategy at the Air Force Air Command and Staff College at Maxwell Air Force Base, Alabama, where I had the pleasure of initially getting to know him prior to the event today. His focus is on international relations and theory, and he has been identified as Air University's first space theorist. He is the writer of the well-known book Astropolitique, as well as other editions and many papers as well. Dr. Dolman received his PhD in political science from the University of Pennsylvania in 1995. He has received awards as an intelligence analyst and as a professor, and he co-founded and is the editor emeritus of Astropolitics, the International Journal of Space Power and Policy. Next to Dr. Dolman is Dr. Laura Grego, who is the Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow at MIT's Laboratory for Nuclear Security and Policy. She is on leave from, and you may also have seen her works for the Union of Concerned Scientists Global Security Program, where she is Senior Scientist and Research Director. She is a physicist by training who works at the intersection of science and policy on issues such as anti-satellite weapons, nuclear weapons, missile defense, and space security. She's a technical expert for the Woomera Manual on the International Law of Military Space Operations and has spoken numerous times before the US Congress, before the UN and other important bodies. She has her PhD in experimental physics from Caltech and a Bachelor of Science in Physics and Astronomy from the University of Michigan. Last on the stage here is Mr. Doug Ligor from the RAND Corporation, where he serves as a senior behavioral social scientist, doing research in the areas of homeland security and national security law. He has an extensive background in immigration law, as well as other aspects of national security law and policy, including outer space law. He is also a US Army veteran, where he served as an armor officer in the company and battalion staff levels in the US Army, and later received his JD from the University of Connecticut School of Law, and a BS in economics from West Point. Would also like to introduce to you Dr. Francesca Letizia, joining us online. And Dr. Letizia is a space debris engineer at the European Space Agency. Her main tasks include the assessment of general compliance with space debris mitigation guidelines, which we'll certainly be discussing at the panel here today. She is part of ESA's delegation to the Interagency Debris Committee, and has worked on trajectory design and collision avoidance strategies for satellite propulsion. She has her PhD from the University of Southampton, where she studied and did her thesis on space debris clouds evolution and worked on planetary protection guidelines. So with that, I am very pleased to introduce the panel here and offer the official disclaimer that the views and opinions expressed by the panelists and by me are our own and do not represent an official position of the United States government or the Department of Defense in any way. And so with that, I will move over here. And I'd like to begin by asking our panelists, why should we be concerned about space debris, or to what extent should we be concerned about space debris? And I'll start with you, Dr. Dolman.
Well, thanks. Yeah, the concern with space debris is immediate and compelling and growing, of course. No spacefaring nation would disagree that we need to limit the growth of space debris. And yet we can't seem to get any agreements that'll stick, or any agreements because they're binding. There's vested interests that go on. And we don't have real public support for anything like that. There's a theory out there, the big sky theory, in which it's plenty of room. There's a vast volume of room, and the amount of room per piece of debris is stunningly large. If we look at the photograph here on the second annual Space Legal Conference, if we actually had that much debris in low Earth orbit so that you could see it lined up like that, we'd have a real problem. We'd already have reached the collapse of the orbit. But that is an artist depiction, and I actually Googled it on Shutterstock. It's called a fanciful depiction of space debris. There's probably, best estimates right now, I think about 10,000 tons of debris in low Earth orbit that was placed there by launch. We can double that, and still to have a depiction of debris this close in low Earth orbit would be 10 to 100 million tons of space debris. So to most of the public and to most of the people, we've been talking about space debris for a long time. We've seen the movies, we've seen gravity, and yet when a satellite does go dark, it seems to be not affecting anything. It's not like gas prices are going up with an event in Ukraine. So my area is really trying to, how do we get the immediacy of the problem to be brought to the attention of the American public, and especially in a way that they'll understand and get behind. But I'll turn it over and probably talk about more of that as we go.
Thanks, and thanks for the invitation to be here. Thanks everyone for taking time out of their day to think about this stuff. I agree with you, Everett. This might be the last time today. But this is a critical problem, and it has been for quite a while. Space debris is, you can think of it as a terrible environmental problem that's hard to solve. It's easy to create and hard to fix because as mentioned, there's lots of mass in space that's debris, but the real problem is not always mass, it's number, because even a very small piece of debris, something the size of a marble, would be destructive to a satellite in a collision. And we have something like 1 million pieces greater than 1 centimeter and less than 10. And that's the sweet, terrible spot, because that's destructive, but almost impossible to track. So you can have big pieces of old, rocket stages that are defunct and floating around. But if you can identify where they are and maneuver out of their way, then you might be able to keep your spacecraft safe. But these smaller pieces, which result from the destruction of the bigger pieces, well, those are really hard to maneuver around because you don't know where they are. You can kind of statistically model where they're going to be. So it's a terrible safety and security problem that continues to get worse because it's very hard to take out those small pieces once they're created. You can imagine these technologies that you can, and we are imagining and we are developing these technologies that you can take the big pieces out, move them out of the way, but we don't have a way to get the small stuff. And the way that small stuff gets created is sometimes carelessness, which we're getting better at. We have debris mitigation guidelines for venting the fuel from your old rocket stages, making sure that you move your dead satellites up and out of the way before you use up the gas tank. But when you look at the space debris over time, you see all of that good work can get swamped immediately by one big anti-satellite test. And that's what's happened repeatedly. And so then that's a security question as well. So that's when the environmental questions run into security questions, and those can be pretty thorny. So you can't deal with them separately. So that's why they become a real challenge. But I'm so glad we're talking about it today. I'm so glad this topic has been elevated by the Pentagon. So I'm looking forward to finding some fixes.
Thank you, and thank you to SpaceCom and the Academy for putting this on. Really, this is a great event, and sorely needed, as my colleagues have said. Why clean up space debris, or why deal with space debris? I think because, and I think it might have been General Miller, we rely on it more and more every day. and not just the military for national security, but our industry and commercial entities rely on it constantly. Position navigation and timing, communications, financial transactions, weather. It saves a lot of lives. And the chaos that would ensue if financial transactions, PNT, weather satellites, military satellites, and other satellites became non-functional because of a Kessler-like syndrome, or not even a Kessler-like syndrome, just a really bad day in space, could severely impact the lives of not just people in the US, but all over the globe. You know, sports packages across the country could go out. You know, there would be absolute chaos on Sunday afternoon. But the other big issue, and Laura brought it up, is conflict. Right? If we don't deal with space debris, then the likelihood of misperception, one bad actor, or not even a malicious actor, right? Just a negligent actor, again, in a bad day in space, can set off a chain reaction to where we believe we might be under threat, or we might be under attack, or other nations might be under attack, our allies might be under attack. And because we don't have the transparency and the SSA and all these other, the data and information that we need to make really good, smart, quick judgments, the threat of misperception and misunderstanding grows. So just leave it there.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Letizia?
Yes, thanks first of all also on my side for the invitation. And just to answer your question, why should we be concerned? I think that there are two interconnected dimensions to the problem. On one end, we have the short-term one, and then the long-term one. And when I'm referred to the short-term horizon, I have in mind that space debris makes the operation of satellites more complex because of the need of monitoring where debris is and planning avoidance maneuver, for example, in case of high-risk conjunctions. And while these maneuvers are usually quite small, so they are not really an issue in terms of fuel, for example, for the kind of satellites that we operate at ESA, they still can cause an interruption of the service. And of the service provided by the satellites, for example, to scientists. And as such, they are currently tolerated until they affect only a small fraction of the operational time. And this connects with the long-term aspect of the problem. So again, if I look at our operational experience, we perform roughly one maneuver every 3 months for each of the satellites in our fleet. But what would happen if we would have to maneuver every month or every week? And these scenarios are actually not so unlikely if the predicted debris population growth in 100 years or 200 years will take place. So the one based on the extrapolation of our current behavior. And these 100 years or 200 years may seem like a very long time scale, but in reality, space debris is one of these typical problems where the longer we wait before taking action and the more costly the reaction becomes. And here reaction refers mostly to limiting the generation of new debris, for example, by ensuring compliance with mitigation guidelines that were already mentioned, like disposing at the end of operational lifetime and limiting the risk of fragmentations in orbit.
Thank you, Dr. Letizia. A previous panelist spoke about some aspects of the proportion of satellites in low Earth orbit, I believe, that were active versus debris. Would you be able to give an overall characterization of our space debris situation in light of the population of active satellites at the various different orbital regimes?
Yes, so we currently have around 5,000, I think 5,500 satellites that are operational, and most of these satellites are in LEO. In total, we have a total of 8,000 satellites in orbit, and just to give some number again, so a bit more than 6,000 are in LEO. To this, we can add 2,000 spent rocket bodies that are also still in orbit. And then, as was mentioned already by the previous panelist, there is a large population of fragments, which are around 40,000 objects. So they represent a bit less than half of the total population of the objects that we can track and catalog. And the rest of the objects in the catalog are objects that we call mission-related objects, or released during the normal operation of the satellites. And then there is all another set of objects that we cannot identify. So we call unidentified objects. And these objects come from the fact that in the recent years, our observation capabilities have significantly improved. So we detect more and more objects, but it's not so trivial actually to associate them to the parent objects that or the originating event, because maybe already this happened several years in the past. So we have also this population. And it was already mentioned in the previous question also that this is just really a small component of the total debris population, because this is just what we can catalog. But as mentioned, there is a much larger population of objects, smaller dimensions, and these objects are mostly the product of several fragmentation events. We count more than 600 in these events that occurred in space. And again, we can go even to smaller dimensions, down to 1 millimeter, and then we have even a much larger population of objects. We estimate around 130 million of objects. And usually it's possible to shield your spacecraft against this kind of debris, but they can still cause damage of particularly sensitive materials, for example, lenses that are used in optical instruments.
Thank you. In the session just before this, General Dickinson referred to the recent uncontrolled re-entry of a Chinese Long March 5 rocket body into the Earth's atmosphere. And amateur space trackers have recently concluded that there was an uncontrolled re-entry of a Chinese rocket body into the moon not so long ago. I'll open this up to the whole panel. To what extent should we be concerned, as we're talking about going back to the moon through the Artemis program and other efforts, with the so-called cislunar regime and potential for space debris issues there? Dr.
Sure,
Grego?
okay. So I don't think that much about cislunar space, but of course, all of us are starting to think about it a lot more, because there's a lot. It is literally far away, but it was sort of figuratively far away for a long time. We weren't expending energy to go back there, but I think that that's coming back on the horizon. And so there isn't lots of space debris there, but you have the same questions. You don't have the same atmosphere that can burn up stuff as it comes to land. So you don't have that cushion that we have on Earth, where you see lots of things, they don't come down and hit people on the ground because most stuff burns up. So you do have to be especially cautious in the moon, and especially careful, and I think create the same types of debris mitigation regimes and responsible behavior protocols there. And that's great, because you can kind of start from scratch. We don't have to have the burden of having decades of not having done a very good job. We can start a little bit better there.
Thank you.
If we're not careful, we're going to export our bad behavior to the moon. Right? As a lawyer and a behavioral scientist, human beings are really good at doing that, unless there are countervailing and counteractions to prevent that behavior from spreading. So if it's even more fragile on the moon, but we want to go to the moon, and we want Artemis, and we want to establish installations on the moon, then the orbits around the moon, I'm not a scientist, but it sounds like they're going to be even more important. So if we don't iron out the behavior now, but rush to the moon with the behavior we have, then again, I'll go back to my earlier comment about conflict. We may be inviting conflict because we haven't figured it out here first.
Dr. Dolman, would you
Well,
like to add anything?
just like around the Earth, what what gives people pause, what makes people think about it is when a human being, an astronaut, the best and brightest of us, is in danger. The moon is going to have problems of its own, though we're talking about colonization of the moon, which is a ways out. We'll also have pretty heavily shielded colonies, but getting there is going to be a problem. Until someone actually gets one dropped on their head, it's going to be seen as something that's too far out, too science fiction in general. The moon is going to become quite important, but I don't think we'll have some of the legal issues of, can I remove a piece of debris if it belongs to Russia, for example? If it belongs to China, it'll probably be a lot easier to just start cleaning up that debris if we get the capability, and we'll probably have to have something like that for colonization of the moon. Right now, it's not something that anybody who has budget authority to do something about it is going to propose doing something about it. So I'm not saying it's not a worry. I'm just very pessimistic about whether anything will be done about it.
Yeah, maybe if I, yes, something. Yes, in my opinion, so the let's say the crash of a single rocket body on the moon in itself should not worry us too much, in the sense that actually some scientists has considered that events like this could even be useful to learn more about the moon surface. However, it's as mentioned already, these events just pose some more general questions, let's say, on how we approach space exploration, especially in view of this renewed interest in the lunar and cislunar missions that you also mentioned. And on one end, this means that more objects will be flying in orbital region where currently we don't maintain any catalog. And this has an impact, for example, already in astronomers, as these objects may be rediscovered as asteroid, and so resources that are spent for asteroid research will be better allocated if we will be able to have a way that we can quickly distinguish which are artificial objects. On the other end, also this approach, so the fact that we are lacking cataloging capabilities at this moment, also has its limits for the development of complex operation in the lunar and cislunar regions. And this, at a certain point, will be needed if we think of concept of operations such as deployment of smaller satellites or the establishment of crewed missions. And in these cases, knowing really where the objects are becomes essential, basically, for safe operation. And finally, I connect to the point that was made before by one of the panelists, is also these events raise the points on whether we should apply space debris mitigation practices in a more systematic way, also for missions that are outside the so-called protected regions. And I can give you the example of at ESA, so the European Space Agency. We actually have been quite proactive in these activities for missions at the libration points. For example, try to estimating which is the probability of return to the Earth, the associated casualty risk, or the potential interference with the protected regions. So we can think that maybe similar analysis will be performed in the future also with lunar missions, together with general recommendation on trying to limit the risk of explosion or the release of objects during operations.
Thank you, ma'am. All right, so the theme for this panel is the Secretary of Defense's second of these tenets of responsible behavior, to limit the generation of long-lived debris. For the panel, what would you consider to be long-lived space debris? What does it mean for it to be long-lived in orbit? And how long is too long?
Well, long-lived is probably over 1,000 years, but anything over 100 years is going to be a problem in our lifetimes. And so I'm going to go at the lowest end of that.
Any other thoughts, Dr. Grego?
I don't know if there's a technical definition of that. That is a very good question. I mean, as explained already a couple of times today, once you get above most of the sensible atmosphere, your space objects will be there essentially decades to kind of forever. And so long-lived, of course, can be years. I think one of the ways you should think about it, though, is, satellites in low Earth orbit orbit the Earth every 90 minutes, right? That's how they stay up. So they're continually plowing through this atmosphere of debris. So there's, I think, a way you think about it is accumulated risk. So, so ways you can think about it may not be long-lived debris so much as the accumulated risk that you're adding to the burden that you're adding to space operations by the amount of debris you're putting in. So you can imagine putting a lot of debris in a fairly low orbit. A good example of that was the Russian anti-satellite test in November, which appeared to increase the risk to the space station. It appeared to double it. I think it's sort of a stable point right now, doubling the risk. So while those pieces of debris will not last for decades, the risk that they're incurring is significant. So I would say that should be part of the way you think about debris, is not just how long it stays up there, but what you're doing to the space environment and the people who want to be using it.
So I leave the technical answers to the people who are much smarter on these things than I am. But as far as a prosaic lawyerly answer goes, I just want it defined. What does long-lived debris mean? If there's no definition, then I think what you're going to see is an increase in arbitrary and capricious behavior about what it means, because states will simply define it in terms of what is in their best self-interest. And that may violate everything that was just said, but there'll be nothing to do about it because we haven't taken steps to put any meat on the bones in terms of a definition. And that, to me, again, invites dangerous behavior and conflict. So I would just say, unlike some of the former panelists, I like definitions. I don't think they're all bad. I think they have a lot to offer. And sometimes, ambiguity is good for a lawyer in terms of, if ambiguity is good for your client and you can operate in ambiguity safely, that's great. But if there's too much ambiguity, it doesn't help your client and it doesn't help anybody else. Right? So I think putting some meat on the bones would be helpful.
Thank you. Dr. Letizia, what are your thoughts about long-lived?
So yes, a difficult question. I also have to admit that I also like the approach with the risk quantification that was just mentioned. I have to say that if you ask me long-lived, I have almost an immediate reflect on think about Leo and comparing with the 25-year rule, just because this is what we are used to deal with when we talk about mitigation guidelines. And so everything that stays more than 25 years since the end of the mission, then it will be for sure long-lived. But I'm aware that this is a very, let's say, simplistic way to look at this problem, and we all know that this time to re-enter strongly depends on the altitude where the object is located and etc. And in fact, I wanted to mention just that last year, I think we prepared some infographics together with UN USA exactly on this topic of on space debris, and one was on the time to re-entry. And we wanted to try to put, let's say, a bit in context this permanence time in space and its relationship with altitude. So for example, we had one of the cases that if an object, let's say, is in orbit at around 800 kilometers, we re-enter now if it would have been launched, in the area of Charles Darwin. And in the case of an object of 1,200 kilometers, then it would re-enter now if it would have launched during the Roman Empire. And this, I think, really gives you an also in the communication with the general public, really the dimension of why it's important to take care of these orbits.
Thank you. So given that the problem is real, what measures are being taken and what measures should be taken beyond what the current rules are to limit the generation of space debris.
Well, let me tell you what we're up against. And this is why I get a reputation sometimes for just being a crotchety old man. If we take the idea that there's 25,000 pieces of trackable debris out there that we're seeing those from the Earth. It's because of the atmosphere. We could get that down to 1 centimeter and below if we could get an exquisite space-based situational awareness system. And we're going to have to do that because as those satellites go plowing through, as you said, it's those small bits of debris that collect on the satellites that degrade solar panels, that shorten the lives of those satellites. As far as the catastrophic creation of a cascade of debris that we see in some movies in here, here's what we're up against: 25,000 trackable items of debris. We've got a space that's, let's say 100, and I'm going high on all these numbers, 100 to 600 miles is where low Earth orbit is. It's a circumference of about 25,000 miles, and it's all the way around the Earth. That's 75 billion cubic miles of space. That means for every one of those pieces of debris, there's 125 million cubic spaces of room for it. If we go to the 1 centimeter plus, which I think I saw about 150,000, 250,000, let's go to let's say there's 1 million of those right now. That's 1 per every 3 million cubic miles of space. If we go, if we go up to, that's 1 for every 3 million cubic miles of space. I apologize for just scribbling this through. That seems like a lot of room. Now, of course, they're not just spread out equally. They're in concentrated orbits. They meet and collide most likely over the poles where those intersect. But it does appear to be a great big sky. And so when we look at 5,000 active satellites, we have to, and there's fewer than that in low orbit, we have to ask what's the likelihood that one of these will have its lifetime significantly reduced by a collision. We've had 2 notable collisions in the last 5 years, but no more than a dozen in the 70 years of space up there. That doesn't seem like a real problem to just launch another. It seems to be within a margin of error. I'm more concerned with geostationary orbit because that's one we have 3,600 slots divided up in geostationary. That puts 1 satellite at every 50 miles. And they're not in a single plane. There's about 500 miles of depth on those as well. So there's a lot of space, but they're all traveling in the same direction. And a nefarious actor, and I'm more worried about my DOD, the people who pay my check, how we might operate in a contested environment. A nefarious actor might put a couple of tons of sand and just blow it up in retrograde of that orbit, scouring through that orbit continuously for a long time. There are huge concerns that we have about what can be done. And much of the concern is adding those 1 centimeter size debris consciously into space to start making that area unusable. The major spacefaring states will not want to do anything that increases debris in space. But in a conflict environment, a war environment, when you take the United States and its allies, who rely on space more than anyone for their ability for their military to work, for the ability to project force outside of its borders, that's an asymmetric advantage. A state that relies not at all on space, such as a North Korea, might find it to its advantage to start doing things in space, doing dirty things in space that will slowly degrade or increase the probabilities of a Kessler cascade, something like that. A state that is in a losing situation or a desperate situation, or a dictator who finds themselves in a corner, might want to take some of those asymmetric capabilities away. So these are the kinds of things I worry about. But we have to be able to convince people why this big sky is actually cluttered. We'll get pictures of you've all seen them with all the bits of debris going around. Each one of those is larger than metropolitan Houston, if you really want to show an accurate depiction. We can still get through it. we have about 700 near passes that we chart with that debris that we have annually. And that means that two items that we're charting come within about a kilometer of each other. If it's a spacecraft that's active, that can maneuver, about 65, 70 on average maneuvers will occur from those spacecraft in a given year. It just doesn't seem like an immediate problem. And if I have just a second, I call it the Katrina syndrome. The idea is, what's the probability that this is going to happen in this year? What's the probability it's going to happen in 100 years? Katrina was a 100-year hurricane. The dikes were not going to hold a 100-year hurricane. Everybody knew it. But within the next 2-year election cycle, what was the probability that a Katrina would happen? Not enough to get the taxpayers to pay for a dike that might not be necessary for 200 years, but might be necessary this summer. It's a difficult proposition. We have to make that palpable in some way that makes more sense than it's just a lot.
Thank you. So, Dr. Dolman, you brought up the issue of a potential conflict that extends to space. And obviously this is a DoD set of tenets of responsible behavior. So what principles should we be putting into place? What rules should we be putting into place to limit the creation of space debris, even when it comes to measures to protect and defend satellites? Dr. Grego?
Yeah, I have pretty strong views on this question and the previous one. And there are some of it in common. I think it is imperative that we have strong norms, and I would prefer stronger than just norms against intentional destruction of satellites on orbit. And I think that's within reach. I think that's something I'm talking to people who actually put things into practice, and I know things are always harder than you think that they are to do, but I think the benefits would be great. We keep seeing, we've had a chance a few times to see how destructive this can be to the space environment. The 2007 Chinese ASAT test put an enormous amount of debris in space, and that was just in the part of space that people use the most, in sort of the 700-kilometer altitude. So it put stuff right where lots of satellites are. And it wasn't all that big of a satellite. It was a modest-sized satellite. But if that had been a sort of a 1-ton satellite, or the kind that, you know, a big national security satellite, that could have doubled the amount of debris in space that people would have to deal with. And we've seen this sort of repeat over and over. I think it isn't necessary to be able to do that. I don't think it's necessary to destroy satellites on orbit to achieve national security aims. I think there's lots of other alternatives. I think we might look to the precautionary principle in IHL. I'm here at a law conference, so I thought I'd say something about law. I'm a scientist, so I don't know that much, but that you should do things in a way that protects people in the environment if you can. So I think there's no reason from a national security perspective that you need to be able to destroy satellites on orbit. Certainly, I think that's true for the United States. Has many other ways to counter adversaries than that. And I think we can see, I might venture that even those states who have just recently tested their anti-satellite weapons, Russia and China in particular, I'm not going to, India may have had different motivations. I think they might have been something along a sort of trying to deter the United States from building space-based weapons. And they might say, one demonstration was enough for us to be able to do that, and we'll let that go. Like, I think there's a possible path there where we might get agreement from heavily space-based users, and that certainly includes China and Russia as well, that might recognize self-interest in limiting these tests once they've maybe one and done would be enough. I think that would be an important avenue to explore. Once politically that's a possible discussion to have, I think we should get started on that. So I think it's an incredibly important piece here because of all the hard work of making sure you screw down your screws in your satellite, nothing flies off, that you move your satellite up and out of the way of the other ones, all that work can be undone in one act. And nothing to say once a shooting war starts and many satellites get destroyed, that's kind of, that would make space not only unusable for the states that are already there, but space is a global commons, and there's countries who have not yet got the benefits of space, and we've made it so that it's difficult for everybody. So that's not a responsible way to, we're not being responsible to our future generations. I think the other piece that I wanted to bring in, though, is this, the change of environment in low Earth orbit is significant. My organization catalogs actively orbiting satellites. I've done it for many years, and usually you kind of get 100 new satellites, but 80 are deorbited. So every year you get like 20 more satellites. That's not the same. That's not what it's like anymore at all. There are twice as many satellites as there were 5 years ago, and it's only poised to be, more and more. There potentially 100,000 satellites by the end of this decade. That's on paper. Who knows where that will end? And most of that will be in low Earth orbit. We don't really know how to deal with that. We don't have appropriate space traffic management. We don't have the appropriate mechanisms to coordinate moving around. And of course, of all those satellites, some of them will fail. You don't have 100% when you build a system. So even if it's a 1% failure, if you have many thousands of satellites, you'll have lots of dead satellites that you'll have to do something about. And those present a huge reservoir of mass that can be, destroyed in a debris collision. So that piece is essential to deal with as well. So we have to have a very strong regulatory regime that addresses that increase in commercial satellite constellations, the mega constellations. It's such a different perspective than it was a few years ago. And Everett was talking about, well, these don't happen very often. Things are very different than they used to be. And I think we will want to deal with it before this happens every year or happens twice a year.
I would just foot stomp what Everett and Laura said, and just add that I think, we probably have to look ourselves in the mirror and ask ourselves whether norms are really the answer here for debris. And if they're not, that means we need binding rules. We need, this is something that when I started with getting into space law, it kind of shocked me. I never saw, as a trial attorney, I never saw the phrase non-binding rule. It just, those two things never went together when I was practicing law at the Homeland Security Department or the Justice Department. You just never saw that. So in a way, that contradiction has caused us to be in this situation we are now. So there's a lot of people who, prior to the November and the Russian ASAT test, thought that we now had a norm after the Chinese test and the Indian test that ASAT tests were not acceptable, that they were irresponsible behavior. I mean, I could make an argument that ASAT tests are now part of a norm, an existing norm that isn't going anywhere unless there's a binding rule to stop it, right? Because what to Laura's point, another country might want to prove that they have the capability, particularly in these geopolitical times, right? That they can take out a satellite. So, and that's where norms have got us with debris. So I think we have to take a hard look at doubling down on what's going on in the UN right now with the open-ended working group and trying to speed up the process, not pay lip service to this idea that we can go from norms to binding rules, but really start working towards binding rules. And it doesn't have to be comprehensive. This doesn't have to be an UNCLOS. This can be targeted to debris because, as Laura mentioned and Everett mentioned, it's in everybody's self-interest. So you can align all the Hobbesian parties here along self-interest if you have to, and you can take that small bite.
Thank you. So given that we have such a rapidly increasing active space object and frankly space debris population, what do you see as the most promising technologies or capabilities for potentially actively removing some of that space debris? I'd like to ask our scientists first. We'll start with Dr. Grego and then Dr. Letizia, then open it up to the other panelists.
So it's not an area I know a special amount about, but this has, we are now at the part where we're actually learning how to do this. And there are commercial companies that are looking to do this. We saw what happened. China demonstrated, apparently not openly, not notifying everyone that's what they were doing, but removed one of their satellites from geosynchronous orbits. So I think the technology for getting big pieces of debris out, I think we're well on the way and almost concept proved. But then I guess the question is, who's going to pay for it? What's the legal regime for saying you're allowed to take this big piece out? Like, I have the money, I have the technology, can I take this out? And then it's up to you lawyers to figure out how to smooth that path that you can remove the things that need to be removed. So I think we're moving beyond the technology to figuring out the economics and the legal regime, I think.
Thank you. Dr. Letizia?
Yes, so for me it's very difficult to answer this question, because what I've seen in the studies that we have performed is that it's very difficult to generalize and to identify, let's say, a single technology that would solve all the problems. So there have been different systems that have been tested and developed, like the robotic arms, clamping mechanisms, nets, and each one of these have different pros and cons depending, for example, on the shape of the object, the attitude, motion, the level of control that is required after the rendezvous phase, but also, for example, the level of versatility that you want to achieve. Imagine if you want to be in a situation where you can retry in the case that the first attempt failed. So there are a lot of trade-off actually ongoing also on the selection on which are potentially good candidates for removal. We can think about very large objects as, let's say, the first ideal candidates, because these are the ones that have the largest impact on the environment in terms of potential fragment debris generation. But on the other hand, they require a very high level of complexity to then perform a control reentry and not, let's say, shift the risk from space debris to on-ground casualty risk. We have seen also a proposal for autonomous kits for the orbit, but we also observe reluctance from operators in embarking this kind of devices. And what we see instead that is there is, I think, a positive evolution is towards this concept of design to removal. So the idea that a satellite is launched already with some, for example, standardized interfaces that makes it easier for a service vehicle in the future to go and connect and grab this object in case of a failure. But I also agree that there are also some other points that are maybe a bit less technical. One was already mentioned, is the point of the cost. And I just want to mention that, for example, at the European Space Agency, as you know, we have procured first debris removal mission, and as a part of this procurement process, there was also the interest of putting emphasis on creating really a recurring business case that could make this type of missions sustainable in the long run. But it's not an easy task. And the other point that for me is probably the most important is that the effect of active debris removal is relevant, the effect on the debris environment, only if the other mitigation measures are applied as well, and specifically, for example, passivation and disposal at the end of life. And in the question before, you have discussed, for example, on how the current level of implementation or adoption of mitigation guidelines is still, let's say, not as expected, or let's say on the low side for some aspects. And with this current level of adoption, the effect of ADR, or active debris removal, will be in any case limited. So we need first to improve much more on the mitigation part before we can, let's say, embark on the remediation efforts.
Thank you. Dr. Dolman?
This is why I probably should say again, this is not the DoD policy, but getting debris out of space, anything that can take something out of space, remove it, is a weapon. And it's ridiculous to think of fighting a war as the United States as a kinetic war. And most people think of war in space as kinetics. We're all blowing things up, we're destroying the environment. By the way, it is an environment and we have to think of it that way. It's pollution, it's no good for anyone. It's a public good and a collective action problem. I think what we see with the Russians and the Chinese with demonstrating these massively dirty weapons is that deterring effect, that we can do this to space if we get into the position to do it. Most of the weapons we see, space war, depending on how you define it, has been going on since at least Desert Storm. Spoofing, jamming, overriding signals, piracy, hacking. These are the kinds of anti-satellite attacks that we're seeing every day, every day. We are looking at capabilities such as temporary and reversible effects. Some more nefarious such things, maybe painting blinding objects, painting solar panels to reduce capabilities, and directed energy to overheat components, to blow out solar panels and even get burned through if necessary. For me, picking out the big pieces of debris, yeah, we've got that. The space shuttle was always thought of as a space weapon by the Soviet Union because we could go up, grab a satellite, bring it back, and even get tech details if we were so inclined to do so, which is why they built their own fluid once and then mothballed it. So my push right now in thinking about how we might deal with a space war is directed energy, because I'm really worried about those smaller objects and the grand proliferation of those. Paint chips that can pit the windshield of the space shuttle. Many of you have seen that. How do we get rid of those? Planetary defense, something NASA is now going out to an asteroid to do a detonation to see if we really can deflect an asteroid. That would be a heck of a weapon, but as long as it's pointed out, et cetera. I'm much more worried about a massive solar ejection in the next 10 years than I am about a Kessler cascade. How do we protect against those kinds of things? Directed energy, I think, is the future for space war because you don't have to catastrophically destroy something. You can get burned through to completely disable a satellite, and you can push satellites with directed energy. Not very far, but certainly small bits of debris with laser, microwave energy, plasma, could be pushed into the atmosphere, pushed out. And the real problem now is targeting. And you can do that with multiple lasers from different directions, so you don't have a target deconfliction problem. The problem is in policy and in law, everyone's going to know that these things can be weapons and used for war. And that's where the kinetic threat of war is going to try to be used to stop a nation from developing such capabilities, because the alternative would be to strike with kinetic. However, once you get enough of these things, taking debris out, removing debris, removing the massive amounts of debris that we expect to come in, and 100,000, 250,000 satellites in the next 30 years or so is probably going to happen. They'll be smaller. Right now, they're basically iPhone 7s with solar panels, the things that are being put up by Starlink and that sort of thing. They'll be harder to see, they'll be harder to find, but we can collect those. So it's a collective action problem, then it's a free rider problem. How do we get positive and negative incentives to get compliance, separate selective incentives? Those are all there. But war has been going on if you consider satellite interference, satellite takeovers, satellite piracy. And when we do start cleaning this up, it's going to be dual use as a weapon. And that's going to be where the real snag is in trying to get, it may be a blessing. It may be enough to force states to say we seriously have to get into this as an international common. The biggest things that we've understood that we've done in the last decade, I think, to change space from being satellites to being capabilities that we rely on to now being a collective action problem that we all have to deal with, is thinking of space as an environment that needs to be cleaned up, and we have to have collective action with that, and as infrastructure, as important as electrical grids and highway systems, et cetera. More so important coming up. As we do that, we may get the buy-in from the larger part of the spacefaring community to get something done now and get something done effective.
Yes, Mr. Ligor.
Just to build off what Everett said and what Dr. Letizia brought up, the issue of the business case. ADR is not going to happen unless there's a business case, right? If my client is a satellite servicing company, I'm going to tell my company right now, don't get into this business. And the reason I'm going to tell them that is because of Article 3 in the Liability Convention, right? You have no idea. It's easy if something falls in the atmosphere or on land. That's absolute liability on the launching state. Article 3 of the Liability Convention says that liability in space is fault-based. Well, as a lawyer, and many of you know this, if it's a fault-based system, then you have to show negligence, right? In order to assign who's going to have to compensate. In order to prove negligence, you need a duty of care because the duty of care is violated and that's what makes you negligent. In order to have a duty of care, you have to have a rule, right? So if we don't have any rules, and by the way, the object is owned by the launching state, the salvor or the remediator, right, is under the jurisdiction and control of that launching state, may be the same, may be different, right? Also under the supervision and authorization of the launching state, right? If I'm a company and if I don't have protection from liability because there's no rule and I don't know how negligence is going to be assessed, what if what I'm pushing blows up, right? And causes a huge bad day in space? Am I going to be liable for that? I have no idea. So why would I advise my client to get into that business? So this gets back to, we need governments, right, to start acting here and to start creating rules. What we have in the OST and the Liability Convention isn't sufficient to create the business case and to create because we know we're going to need industry and our commercial partners to do this. There's just no way around it, right? And it's got to be paid for. So you need governments to pay for it, and you need governments to set up the rules because companies ain't going into space unless there's some predictability, it's particularly on this issue.
And Dr. Dolman, your comments about thinking about space as an environment also make me think about the principle from OST Article 9 that talks about avoiding contamination of the space environment. Previous panelists and speakers here have already talked at some length about the due regard principle there and consultations in the event of expected harmful interference. But do you think that the harmful contamination principle presents an area that we should be looking to add more teeth to in terms of some kind of enforcement mechanism? And then what might be a trigger point for concluding that harmful contamination has occurred?
I think very much so. And I'd like to actually see it because we can get liability for negligent contamination of the environment. And we could find ways to get liability, I think, for harmful contamination of the space environment. And that could get into what you need is what I think are called positive or negative incentives instead of enforcement in the international regime. Whereas there's got to be some penalty for doing that. Now, we look at top-down approaches that are based on force, the ability to enforce a law or rule or penalty. We look at bottom-up approaches in which things like identification is so critically important because you have to determine who's being a bad actor, and then you have to avoid that bad actor. It's why certain things like the World Trade Organization works. Most actors abide most of the rules most of the time because there's incentives for doing that. That is getting most favored nation status amongst the members who abide by those rules. There's access to markets that you would not otherwise get. That's why I say it's a collective action program. We have to find a way, I think, within legal parameters that you have separate and selective incentives for participating in it, getting the benefit of having a clean space environment, having a cooperative space environment. And this may very well be a terrific way to start looking at it, start moving in that direction. The incentives should be such that you can't, they're not like a police power. We don't have a cop, but there's something desirable to gain or something to avoid if you are called out. And we need to find out what those are, how we can get, and so international cooperation, maybe in a space traffic management system or a space-based situation where we can see what's out there amongst our good friends and allies, and we share that data so that we all have a common sight picture. You get access to that if you're a good actor. You don't get access to that if you're a good actor. If you're a bad actor, you don't get access to certain launch services. You don't get access if we have, say, a refueling capability for satellites to something like that. That's the kind of enforcement that we need to look at for a collective action, public good, which is near Earth orbit.
Thank you, sir. Any thoughts on that issue from our other panelists?
Well said, totally agree. It is really helpful to think about it from an environmental perspective, from a future generations perspective, from a carrots and sticks perspective. I would note that, you know, when you build a building and pull a permit, usually you have to put down a deposit that says that you're going to abide by the zoning laws and the permitting laws, and only when you've finished your building do you get that money back. You don't get it back if you didn't, you know, fix the sidewalk or whatever. I think you know, we can imagine doing the same for using space. You should be able to put down your escrow deposit and say, if I don't do what I'm supposed to do, I don't get it back, or you don't get access to geosynchronous orbits, or you don't get, as you had a wonderful list of all the ways that you can incentivize states to act well. And of course you have to do that internationally, because you don't want to move to flags of convenience where your regulation in the United States is terrible, so I'm going to be launching out of some other place. So you really have to do it collectively. I think that's really important too.
Well, at this point, I think I'd like to check and see if there are any questions from the audience or from online. Mr. Grunert, have we had any questions coming in over Zoom?
We do, sir. There are a number of questions that have come in over the Zoom video chat. Some of them are interrelated, so I'm going to try and combine maybe two for the panel. The first is from Mr. Rolando Maraquin, and this is for anyone on the panel. He asks, most technologies that could be used to address on-orbit space debris, high-energy lasers, co-orbital satellites like China's SJs or Northrop Grumman's mission extension vehicle, very much like the panel was discussing, things like the space shuttle and whatnot could be put into that category as well, could also be used as weapons. So his question is, how do those working on the on-orbit debris problem hope to clean up debris while signaling to the international community that their intentions are not hostile? And then kind of related question, Mr. Adrian Times asks, what would be needed to get the multiple various and currently siloed efforts to do something about space debris to coordinate?
All right. Any panelists like to take up either of those questions? How do we get better signaling mechanisms of good intentions for people who are trying to do active debris removal, for example?
Say really quickly, I think it's a matter of building the institutions, because I think you're going to need multilateral international institutions in order to convince people, countries, other entities and space actors that dual use technology isn't a threat to them. And the prior panel talked about it: forums, communication, data and information sharing, right? We lack the institutions for that to happen. And that's why we lack the development of things like due regard and what does it mean to I mean, the idea that an ASAT test doesn't violate the OST, I think shocks a lot of people who, as lawyers, would look at the OST and say, it's interference or it's contamination. It's one of those. The idea that it's not is a little absurd to me, right? And one of the reasons that we haven't developed these things is because we just don't have the institutions to develop them, right? How did due process develop in the United States? You know, it's a phrase in the Constitution. It, at the time, was relatively meaningless in terms of what it would mean for the United States. But our institutions have given meaning to due process over the years and enliven the rights of people in this country just, immensely, right? So we can do that with things like due regard and interference and what does it mean to have dual use technology and how to operationalize that and engage in that activity. But unless we build the international institutions to be the forums that General Miller talked about, I just don't think it's going to happen. Again, why would I advise my client to do RPO if there's any danger that liability is going to be assessed to me in a negative way? And you probably couldn't pay me enough, right? If I'm going to start a war, right? There's not enough money, maybe some companies would take it, I don't know, but so I'll just leave it there.
My first thought was that we contract out waste management to do it, but that won't work. In a case like this, there's no way the United States could start using, say, directed energy to start taking micro and medium-sized pieces of debris out of orbit without scaring just about everybody, even our allies. The only way you can get that to be seen as non-nefarious is to do it for about 10 years and do it well, do it without interfering or harming anyone else. And then it starts to look like a public good, perhaps. But it's one of those things where if it's important enough, it may have to be done even in an area that is international. It may have to be done unilaterally. And there's many examples of that going back even from British stopping slavery movement and Americans now in human traffic on the open seas. There's many ways to start doing what is in the best interest of others, and they won't like it at first. They'll be afraid of it. That's an option. Just do it. But that's going to be a tough sell.
So I'm unconvinced about the utility of lasers for this mission, but definitely will look into it more. But I think the more immediate question anyway are these RPO satellites, and that's a general question. It's a general concern when you're talking about security and safety in space. And again, of course, the implementation is a lot more complex, but one can imagine for satellites that can maneuver actively and have a good ability to do that. Most satellites can do a little bit of station keeping, but these are really different types of technologies. They don't look like regular satellites. Their jobs are to move around, be able to approach closely. They could have an obligation to have a beacon or something that identifies where they are. Here I am, here's where I'm going, this is what I'm doing. And that identifies you as, this is what my intention is, and I'm going to this piece of debris that you've contracted me to come and get. You can't fix their capability of being able to do other things by doing that. You can only, you can't keep every satellite safe from something like that, but I don't think that's the approach anyway with the dual use capability. You want to make sure you don't mistake it for something else. And there are remedies to do that. You make sure that it broadcasts where it is and what it's doing. And if you're not doing that, then you might need to explain who you are and what you're doing and why are you coming close to me. In the last panel, I was thinking about this question of how close is too close. And I think that answers are different, whether you're talking about safety or security. So too close might be different if it's something that's moving around, is not identifying itself. You're not really going to be able to fix that problem technically anyway. You can move your satellite, but then you're in a game of cat and mouse. You're not going to take that vulnerability off the board. So I wouldn't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. The ability to do some good things with these capabilities, you'll still always have a bit of vulnerability, but there's not really much you're going to do about that except make sure your space systems are resilient and that you're confident in your ability to do things. And I feel like, again, I'm always an optimist, that there's a lot of ways to approach solving that problem in a positive framework.
Yeah,
So it sounds
maybe
like,
just to, oh, sorry. Yeah, no, I wanted just to continue on this because I think that it can be connected to the broader topic of transparency that was mentioned already a couple of times. And of course, it applies for the close proximity operation satellites, but actually is something that is much broader in the topic of space debris in general, and connects also with the second part of the question that was on this having more coordination in the multiple efforts that are ongoing. What we see still now is that so operators sometimes are a bit reluctant in sharing information also on, let's say, traditional missions. Would it be this, for example, what are the planned maneuver, what are the disposal approach, what is the anomalies that are experiencing, and an aspect really related to the operations in general. And I think that there would be really a value in going the direction of having an enhanced sharing of this kind of information, also to create a more, let's say, a general understanding of how we approach risk and what are the where different actors set their thresholds in terms of the risk that they consider to be acceptable. And so I think also this could be an important element to consider.
Yeah, so it sounds like, based on what you've all been saying, that doing something that would match with the SecDef's Tenets of Responsible Behavior regarding making communications and sharing information would also be an important way of getting after this debris problem, and as well as, frankly, perhaps starting to establish some state practice or measures for actually engaging in international consultations in the event that we think our space activities might have the potential to cause potentially harmful interference, given the risks that you've described for, if you go and take your debris removal satellite and the target ends up blowing up, what happens? I could see that really falling into that category. Do we have any other questions from the local audience here? Anything that people would like to ask our panelists before we return to the next online question?
Hi, I'm Laura Cummings with Astroscale US. And my question goes to what we just briefly talked about a little bit, which is risk. So right now for debris and on-orbit servicing, RPO, one of the big things is how do you quantify risk? The FCC is looking at this in their orbital debris rulemaking of, do we look at this on the aggregate or just a one-off spacecraft? And the broader community for, if you want to do a controlled reentry of a rocket body, how do I calculate that risk? Since we have a bunch of scientists here, I think a really important question is, how do we amplify the ongoing coordination, discoveries, evaluation of how to quantify risk? And what can we do to amplify that so it supports safety and possibly security as well? Thank you.
So Dr. Grego, would you like to take that one first?
Sure, but I bet Dr. Letizia has a better feel for these quantities than I do. So I actually am going to pass it over to her.
Okay, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Letizia.
Okay, yes, so this is a very good question, and actually it connects to some of the elements that we were mentioning before. I have to say that in our group, in our office, we are really looking at these risk assessments as a way of enhancing the current mitigation guidelines. In our case, the approach that we adopt is a bit different from what you mentioned, in the sense that we try to look at the space mission not only in terms of the compliance with the defined guidelines, but also which is the potential of adding new debris to the environment. And in this way, we really define a risk metric where we look at which is the probability that this object is involved in a fragmentation, and which is the severity that this fragmentation will cause to other actors. So for us, and I have to stress this is for us, this is a way that could be very interesting to try to enhance current guidelines. Because current guidelines have some limitation in the sense that there is not, so let's say if you look at them from top down, there is not really, they're not derived from a definition of what we intend to have as a sustainable environment. And if you look them bottom up, they're also not connected to how the environment is actually evolving. So by introducing this kind of risk assessment, this is how we we are trying to build this connection to these two elements that I just mentioned. And in our work, we have been focusing mostly on the space debris side of the question, and also looking at mission as a whole. So what I mean is that, as you mentioned, if you are analyzing a constellation, we will look at the risk of the whole constellation together. But also we consider as part of the mission also the risk brought by or carried by the rocket body that is used to inject these satellites in orbit. Sometimes these objects are not disposed, so you can have, for example, a rideshare mission that deliver in orbits many small satellites that on their own they have a limited risk associated to them, but then maybe an upper stages of 1000 kilos is left in a long-lived orbit. So we are trying exactly to go in this direction, and we think that is an interesting development, but this is still an open research topic. So I cannot give you a concrete answer on the, let's say, the next steps, but for sure there is a lot of research going on in this direction.
Dr. Dolman.
If I might, yeah, we assess risk in the military quite differently than might be appropriate for this. You know, we're looking at mid-max game theory, sort of what could happen, worst could happen. The very best risk assessments I have seen in space, and this is over 40 years, comes from the insurance industry. They take the most detailed, they try to factor in everything they can because they're going to make money on this. The models that they use, if we could add in, say, something more about amount of debris that's caused. If there's how long a piece of debris that you put into space, how long is the liability going to be for that? Start making some sort of rules and decision-making procedures down below along that line. The insurance industry will start factoring those risks, and we can start doing, say, mandatory insurance or requiring insurance before on launch vessels of anyone that we have. And we pretty much do that. But the more we can articulate the kinds of risks we're looking at it on debris, I think they probably handle it free market style pretty well.
Mr. Ligor.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think insurance has a role, but insurance, remember, also underwrites a certain amount of risk taking, right? And that risk taking may not line up with what's in the public's best interest, right? So it's really a question of what risk are you talking about, who's going to define it, and what risk rule is going to rule, right? So, you know, the Iridium, when it smashed into Cosmos, that was a business decision based on their risk profile. And I'm sure their level of insurance and, I mean, they got good information from SpaceTrack that this collision was going to happen, if I'm not mistaken, right? And they went ahead and made that business decision anyway. And now we're all living with it, right? So should the public's definition of risk rule in a case like this? Maybe not, but it at least should be part of the process. So how do you determine, you know, companies are going to define risk that's in their best interest, not in the United States' best interest. Why? Because people who run companies have a fiduciary duty to the company. The fiduciary duty, a legal duty to make sure the company remains profitable, right? That's going to have a different risk profile than the people who are living in Texas near SpaceX launches, right? So, but to incorporate their definition of risk, you got to do things like go to the Federal Register and go into the notice of comment, right? And go to this long rulemaking process that everybody says is going to slow down our development in space. Well, maybe, but maybe that's not such a bad thing if we're actually end up with the right risk model, right? That's going to bring everybody on board and provide good faith into what we're doing, not just nationally, but internationally.
Given that in today's space industry, the commercial sector is really setting the standards in a lot of ways. They're accomplishing new things in new ways. How do we make sure that we have the right expertise within the government for coming up with those right risk standards when it's the commercial industry that's really kind of defining new missions out there?
There are agencies who are trying to pay better, right, to lure the talent over. But it's a great question. I certainly don't have an answer to that.
Well, on on the military side and on the side of Space Force doesn't really want to get involved in any kind of a combat in space or anything like this, and certainly doesn't want to be the space cop. But in international common areas, the open oceans, the international airspace, where there is no sovereignty, the only legitimate use of force under the nation state system in those areas is military force. There's also a principle called flag follows commerce. And it may not matter what we want to do, how we want to do it, as we start expanding commerce in outer space, commerce itself, business itself, may start asking for those protections, piracy help, removing obstacles, search and rescue, weather prediction that we're doing well now, but we'll have to do better, and even a international policing of norms and rules that are established. So Space Force is going, as time goes on and as commerce gets developed, as we're moving from 300 to 400 billion dollars in gross receipts per year already, up over $1 trillion. There will be requests, just whether it was the American West and beaver pelts or wherever else we've gone, and you get value. The military is the first one in that has to start doing the enforcement of any agreed upon laws or regulations that we'll have, whether they like it or not.
And I note that in the fiscal year 2022 National Defense Authorization Act, Congress formally added the Space Force to the Posse Comitatus Act. So I don't think there's any risk of us being put into the Space Police mission right now. But Major Gruner, did you have any other questions coming in from online?
We
right.
do have a couple of other questions,
All right,
sir.
I think we've got time for at least one more.
Okay, let's see. So we have a question from Ijeoma Anwalotsu. On debris, how can we ascertain whether a space object is actually a piece of space debris versus something else, perhaps a space situational awareness deception or a spy satellite of some kind, which kind of gets into definitions of space debris. How do we determine that something is debris that should be removed versus something else that should not be interfered with?
Question.
This is where I think, again, rules and definitions would help, right? Because they're, different companies, entities and countries have different definition of debris right now. We don't have an agreed upon definition of debris. Is a defunct satellite that has like ITAR material on it really debris? I can make a good argument that it's not really debris, and I don't want it touched. So I think, we got a lot of work to do. It's a really good question. I think we got a lot of work to do to determine what the debris is that is true debris that we want to remove, and that we all agree can be removed and removed safely. And maybe we categorize it and identify it. But again, I think you're going to need an institution to get on that and do that and bring all the players to the table and say, yeah, I agree that we can touch that rocket stage and push it into a graveyard, orbit or deorbit, or whatever we want to do. But don't touch that dead satellite, because now I have an ITAR issue with that, and I need to handle that. So I need to pay for it. Different circumstances.
Dr. Grego?
I think this might be alluding to the idea that there may be space mines that are being disguised as debris that would be activated at some later date, because I think that is a technique that has been used in the past, maybe is being used now, I don't know. I don't think it would impact the broad strokes of what we're trying to do, which is rid space of space debris. I don't think most of them would be space mines. And also, if something has been sitting in space for a long time, for many years or several years without moving, space is a pretty harsh environment. It's hard to maintain the health of something and be convinced that it'll work when you want it to, if it hasn't been, maintained in some way. And if it's meant to be small without, solar panels, it has to subsist on a battery, which will eventually drain. So I wouldn't expect a large population of them, although, you might, as things get smaller and smaller, you do have to think about it. But I don't think from a debris point of view, it's going to impact the bigger project of making the space environment better.
right, did I see there was a hand up earlier? Yes.
Hi, I was wondering what percentage of long-lived space debris is from the United States? I just asked this to kind of continue that theme of space debris is like climate change, because that could affect, what sort of proposals other countries might be receptive to. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Good question. Anybody like to answer that?
So I'm going to answer that by saying I don't know the percentage, but there is something that I think is potentially interesting, an interesting perspective on that. There is, so I can't say for sure, but there is a, there's been some analysis about the discussions around the 2007 Chinese ASAT test, which, of course, there was a discussion before that happened, and people would have to sign off and go up and up the chain of events, but that they may have been provided advice, or someone might provide advice saying the United States and the Soviet Union / Russia has produced an enormous amount of debris. And the amount that we're going to produce with this test is small compared to that. So why should anyone complain? And on, from an arithmetic point of view, that's probably true. And it's a defensible, true statement, but it's not, politically true. Of course, people would object to this all at once dumping of debris into space. But you can kind of imagine as that happens, I don't know what kinds of conversations happened around the India space ASAT test, and they did it, more carefully at a lower altitude, so that debris would have cleared out much faster. But of course, none of those ASAT tests, even if at low altitudes, come without risk to higher altitudes because things get kicked up. So I think it's an interesting question when you're thinking about the perspectives of new countries coming into space. And of course, they'll look and say, the United States and Soviet Union, they've had their share. They put a ton of stuff up there. So, give us a break. We're just starting out. We don't have the technologies that you do. Maybe we have a bigger budget for space debris than you should have. I think it's an interesting analogy to greenhouse gases that, just as we're getting the ability to do these things, you're shutting down our ability to do them as well as we want to. So I think some of these ideas that Everett was talking about are really interesting, these ideas that you partner with, new space states and say, we will help you do this better. We will help you make your space enterprise more sustainable and more debris friendly. And if you, agree to these debris mitigation guidelines, we'll help you with space technologies. And that, I think, might be like a nice way to think about it.
And I would point out that the NASA Orbital Debris Program Office puts out a quarterly debris-related newsletter, and it has a satellite box score at the end of a lot of those newsletters where it divides up active satellites and debris from several of the major spacefaring states. You can go to that to refer to it. I think the United States is one of the higher, but we're definitely not the highest in terms of that active satellite to debris ratio. There are some countries that tend to have a higher debris to active ratio than us.
I think it's an important question under the Outer Space Treaty, right? We're responsible for whatever debris we have up there. What are we going to do about it? If it's US, Russia, China, Russia, US, China, and we keep putting more debris up there, or the fact that debris is self-generating now, we're under the Outer Space Treaty responsible for that. So if I'm a developing country, I'm inclined to call the US in breach now of the treaty, or certainly in breach very soon if it hinders and impedes, realistically hinders and impedes my ability to develop my launch capability, to put my satellites up there, which, by the way, probably aren't going to be as sophisticated and maneuverable, right? So your satellites are nice and maneuverable, so you get to keep your stuff in LEO and GEO. And again, I'm the developing country. I can't do it now. I can call you out and say you breached the treaty. Now, maybe nobody cares because, it's a huge power differential. But I think, we risk losing moral high ground that we want to have and that we continue to want to have. So it's a really, really important question to ask.
Thanks. All right, do we have any other final audience questions? Lightning round. If we see none from the audience, then we'll turn back online, or I see Professor Biller is coming over, so maybe wrapping up. Last chance. All right.
Okay, thank you very much, Major Green, and to all of our panel. Clearly, this is an issue that is vitally important to our long-term use of space. I want to thank you all for offering your expertise and your time. And as a token of our appreciation, our coveted second annual space